With that, Hans was our last patient speaker. What we are going to do now is we're going to have our second panel. And for this panel discussion, we'd like to introduce all our speakers again. So that's Hans, we have Dr. Ferry, we have Jan, we have Dr. Shane House, and also joining us will be Denise Gabrielson. So Denise is actually a registered dietitian at St. Michael's Hospital. And she has kindly joined us to answer any questions related to diet as well. So while we're still hungry, I'm going to start with some questions that we got from the audience. And again, we have an overwhelming amount of questions right now. If you can see my notes, I have about 1 billion notes because the questions are just pouring in. So we're going to do our best to answer the questions outside of this panel, but I'm going to get to the top questions that are coming in right now. So in terms of diet, nutrition, naturopathy, and again, what we encourage is not just the health experts on this panel, but also the patients, the survivors, the caregivers, all to weigh in because, again, the whole point of this panel discussion is for us to learn from each other. So the question comes from Shannon. Shannon's from Kingston, Ontario. She's a patient survivor. She wants to know how to keep weight on long after surgery. What kind of vitamins or foods are helpful to stay healthy? And in a similar vein, we have Pat from Nova Scotia. She's a patient. Can I ever eat normally after treatment? So anyone can go ahead and take those questions.
So I can start with keeping weight on after surgery. Generally, we tend to focus on choosing high calorie and high protein foods, using things like healthy fats or energy dense foods, especially if you're still struggling with smaller portions throughout the day and eating more often. And another important thing is avoiding any unnecessary dietary restrictions. So discussing any special diets with your team that you're interested in so that we can discuss evidence and also risks and benefits. Because a lot of diets are restrictive and you want to be able to eat as much as possible in a wide variety of foods if possible. And also to limit low calorie and low protein foods, particularly if you're still experiencing things like early satiety or feeling full quicker than usual on smaller portions of food.
I think I can comment a little bit about. Awesome. Go right ahead. I'll just say briefly about my experience I've treated around 1,000 patients who've undergone a gastrectomy or esophagectomy, and when patients say, "Will they ever eat normal again?" What I usually explain, as has been described earlier, is that that clearly the first 3 to 6 months is when your body's adapting to a new configuration. And that's the most difficulty that people have. But usually by 6 months to a year, and then a year after, after a year, most people are able to enjoy food as much as they did previously. That's with total gastrectomies, partial gastrectomies, esophagectomies. We've seen that with all patients. They have this dip in the first 3 to 6 months. Then they start to get back up by 8 months to a year. And usually it's around 10 pounds less than they were initially, but they don't quite get back to how they were before. But the vast majority of patients, I find, they're able to get back to a normal diet.
I was just going to make a quick comment about the term normal, because I think everyone hears that expression normal. And to me, there's nothing wrong with having a bit of a finite. So, even prior to my personal health journey, would have people that would come to our restaurant, diabetic or who had celiacs, and oftentimes they were a little bit despondent or upset that they couldn't eat the entire spectrum of foods. But as and actually I have an artist friend who kind of told me this. He lives in Ontario, so he said sometimes if the page is too big, it's overwhelming. And so what he does is he tapes off the page to kind of defocus of the work that he's doing. And so if someone comes to me with, I'm allergic to whatever the thing is, to me that just kind of helps focus what it is that I'm making. Again, I'm not trying to be Pollyanna and say, well, it's a good thing that you eat everything you used to be able to eat or during this time, wherever on your journey here. But rather than thinking of it as a negative, if you think about like a box of 10 million crayons, sometimes it's hard to start painting when you have so many options. So being able to kind of pull those parameters in, it's not a bad thing. So rather than focusing on what you eat, really embrace the things that you are able to eat and then be creative with that.
I can probably speak on my personal experience on it as well. And really, I threw everything, any dietary restrictions out the window. The major concern after getting my stomach removed was just gaining any weight, any type of weight. And so I ate anything that I could take down, whether it was even something bad. Um, Fast food, the works. I just wanted to make sure that I could gain some sort of weight, as that was the primary concern. And drinking water, right, is still a challenge. It was back then, and it still is now. And so I drank a lot of Coke, a lot of pop to just keep the food down. And I know it's really against the nutritional value of having Coke, but really, I just wanted to make sure that I could stomach something down. And oddly enough, Coke was the one that helped. But over time, as I gained the weight, you become more mindful of what you're eating, and of course, I do want to eat as healthy as possible, and so you make those healthy choices as time goes on, and you have that confidence. And what Hans mentioned earlier, your palate, it becomes more refined, and then you kind of have an idea of what you're able to intake, what stuff you should avoid. And there's certainly things that I do not like, like pork, for example. As much as I would like to eat it, it's really hard and challenging most of the time. So I tend to stay away from that. And if I could, I'd lean towards more a vegetarian, I guess, setup if I could. And for me, actually, one of the other funny things is that the spicier, the better. So um, I found that I didn't like hot food as much before, but I love hot food now, or spicy food now. So the spicier it is, the better for me. So I guess really to listen to your body, listen to what you can intake, and then kind of play around with it. It still really is, even to this day, I'm still playing around with what I can eat. Some days it works, some days it doesn't. So it's all kind of in flux.
And if I can just add to that, I think one of the things so diet and nutrition is probably the number one issue that is discussed in our support groups. And for me personally, I think one of the things that we always try to tell everyone, and I've gone through it myself, is you have to work with what sits well with you. So just as an example, I'm Italian, and for me, one of the things I just could not touch for about the first, I'd say 5 to 6 years, was pasta with tomato sauce. That combination was just horrific for me. But I kept trying and kept trying and kept trying. And 90% of the time it would come right out of me. And then it was only about maybe 2 years ago that I can now eat it. So it's never give up. And I think normal for me might be good, but you have to discover your own normal. And that's one of the things that we also talk about, is to try not to get so frustrated with food and how your body reacts to it. You have to be kind to yourself, and you have to be forgiving of just what you're going through, and allowing yourself to learn what you can eat. And I've learned so much. I don't put anything into my body that without looking at what it contains. I may still decide to make bad choices sometimes, but at least I know what's going into my body. Whereas before, I would never even, to be honest with you, I didn't think about it before.
Thank you for sharing that. And actually, this kind of leads into my next question. Dr. Ferry and anyone else here, what is the difference between a total versus a partial gastrectomy? How does that affect your ability to eat?
I guess I'll start. I'll comment on the definition first. I'll say a partial gastrectomy, or what most people oncologists would call a subtotal gastrectomy, is when you take out the bottom half of the stomach, and the total obviously is when you take out the entire stomach. And all it really is, we choose which operation to do depending on where the tumor is located. So our goal is really to get rid of all the cancer. We try to leave as much a small amount of stomach at all possible, because stomach has incredible capacity to stretch. So even if we leave a small amount of stomach, it can stretch and provide some increased capacity to eat as much as possible. In general, we find that people who have at least even a partial gastrectomy, initially, as I said, around the first 3 to 6 months are the hardest, but that the ability to eat larger volume food it stretches much quicker than the small bowel. A small bowel, someone who's had a total gastrectomy, a small bowel does stretch out, but the ability to have the large meals is much more limited if you have a total gastrectomy than if you have a subtotal gastrectomy.
Okay, and I think we have a good mix actually on this panel of people with total rather than partial gastrectomy. So I know for myself, I had a total gastrectomy that was in 2011, whereas Teresa had a partial gastrectomy. So it's always interesting because I am now almost 10 years out of my surgery, and I find that I'm actually gaining too much weight. So I have to watch what I eat. But kind of similar to what you were saying, the first year was very challenging. By the second year, I found that my weight finally stabilized. I wasn't losing as much weight. And then after year 2 to year 5, that's when I started gaining weight to the point where now I have to be cautious about what I eat. So I think to anyone in the audience that's listening out there, it doesn't matter if your whole stomach or or part of your stomach is removed. It is possible to gain weight. It is possible to enjoy food. It is possible to eat Halloween chocolates while doing a conference right now. So don't give up. Catherine did want to ask Hans or anyone else on the panel, how do you know how many calories you are taking within the day? And could you share with us some of your favorite high-calorie foods?
Well, so as I mentioned, that food diary. So I think that's the thing. I mean, luckily we have the resource now. I mean, I just, again, kind of showing my age. I was in the hospital at MD Anderson when I got my first iPhone, which was the first, version of the iPhone, which was like, wow, I can sit in my hospital bed and, look things up on my phone. So I feel like such an old man, but how cool is it that if you don't know how many calories or what the protein is or what the nutritional value is, you can Google any food, at the click. So that is super helpful. And also there are a lot of food tracking apps now that you can sort of eat it. You can kind of put in, I just had, roughly this much food. And so I think that's a tool that, especially as you begin that journey, as you're being mindful is one thing, but remembering, through the course of the day, eat and then totaling that up, that's another level of mindfulness that you might not want to be engaged in. It's sort of a full-time job. So tracking that as you go along, I think is crazy helpful. And then, I'm someone who actually I lived 7 years with a partial gastrectomy, and then at year 7 we had to do a total gastrectomy. So I've had both. And so, the one thing that sort of changed, as I mentioned, the size of meals now are much smaller for me. And so I try to graze throughout the day. So this is the kind of where it becomes anecdotal for each person. But for me, nuts were probably my saving food, and still are. I am constantly eating, Brazil nuts are 33 calories each. And they're, good calories, and it's fat and it's protein, and it's for me, it's very easy to tolerate. So, but even nut butters, so cashew butter, almond butter, peanut butter, those are the kind of things that I have on hand. Even if I'm traveling, I keep a little Ziploc bag full of those kind of things: seeds, nuts, grains, granola. And it's about finding what works for you. And there's sometimes, and somebody says, that's a great idea, and then they try it, and it doesn't quite them. So, but that's, smaller doses throughout the course of the day, for me, and then also adding a variety there. So it's not just almonds. You then switch to cashews, or you have a mix where you can, change them out. But that seems to work.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on diet or nutrition? I know we do have a whole presentation by Denise from last year on substitution. So how do we increase amount of calories and proteins? That's available in our archive from last year. Also, again, in your e-package, you should have received the recipe book, again, with a lot of options for substitutions. But just before we wrap up the diet conversation, anything else anyone want to add about vitamins or nutrition in general?
I think that sometimes there are certain times where focusing on the number of calories can be important, particularly if you're losing weight. But sometimes it can be also an extra thing to focus on when eating is sometimes already a chore, and then it can also sometimes increase anxiety in counting the calories. Am I getting enough calories? Am I getting enough grams of protein? So I'd also encourage people to also, particularly as you're further out, starting to focus on just how the food makes you feel. Are you enjoying it? You may not get back to your baseline weight, but do you have enough energy? Are you feeling fatigued during the day? Are you able to get through activities that you'd like to get through? And also using those as measures of health as well. Katie, you mentioned vitamins, and Dr. Sheenhouse did touch in her presentation on there are some vitamins in particular that you need to focus on post-gastrectomy and just be aware of, like vitamin D and calcium, folate, iron, and B12. And those are nutrients that there's a higher risk for not getting enough because of absorption issues post-gastrectomy. So those are some nutrients to pay attention to.
Okay. And Dr. Sheenhouse, I guess this question is more for you. Outside of seeing a registered naturopath, what supplements should I take over the counter?
That's a tough one to answer because it really, like I said before, it depends on deficiencies. And as we've talked about the most common deficiencies, it's really patient specific and it depends on what they've had. So it's hard to say like everybody needs this vitamin. I mean, if we were to test everybody's vitamin D, most people who live north of the equator are deficient. Right. But I think it's really patient specific. I mean, sometimes we'll say to someone, if they're really having a difficult time with their oral intake, maybe we look at a high quality multivitamin, right? But it really depends on the patients. It's hard to sort of say everyone needs this or that, right?
Okay, so I think that's a great point, in that we want to be patient specific. We want to make sure that you have a really good healthcare team. So whether it's your medical team or a registered naturopath that you're going to, it's really important that the supplements are targeted to you because, like Dr. Sheenhouse did say, there are some mal effects of certain supplements as well. So we really need to be careful, and we need to make sure that we're all in this as part of a team. I will now focus a little bit more on other questions. So I guess this one is mostly for people that have had surgery and Dr. Ferry as well. So I had a total gastrectomy due to a mutation. I was just wondering if there's any work on transplant rather than trying to live a new normal life without a stomach, and that's from Michelle. So I guess transplanting a stomach. Why aren't we doing it?
Yeah. We've that's a great a great question. There's a lot of interest in regenerative medicine to replace organs that we have to take out for other diseases or cancer. What we found is that it's always best to use one's own organs and reconstruct them in a way that that allows us to eat, rather than trying to put in something there that doesn't belong in there. So unfortunately, we have not found we've not gone to the stage where where we can reconstruct a stomach from off the shelf. I will say it is easier to do things that there is work into trying to reconstruct certain tubes which don't require a physiology of the stomach. The problem with the stomach, it's not just a vessel, it's also a very physiological organ. And try to reconstruct that as a transplant, it'll be exceedingly challenging. There is some movement in like vessels or even trachea or airway where we're looking at reconstructing it from cells and scaffolding on the outside, but we're not quite ready to reconstruct or transplant a stomach.
Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to showcase a video that we had just before this presentation. So Mike, if we can get those slides up.
Hi, my name is Helena. I'm from Winnipeg, Canada. I am a survivor of stage 3 stomach cancer. My chemotherapy ended in May 2017. For years, I am suffering from chronic diarrhea, which I try to control by diet, often unsuccessfully. My stool is sometimes oily and I see undigested food in it. I have diabetes, which I control by diet and walking daily. I would like to know more about how to deal with malabsorption of food and how to cope with chronic diarrhea. Thank you.
So Hans mentioned diarrhea earlier on in his presentation. I know it might be something embarrassing, but everyone that's dealt with stomach cancer has probably dealt with this during their journey. So any wisdom to share, please do share.
So there's a few things that can actually contribute to malabsorption. So there's a few options for managing chronic diarrhea. Particularly if Helen didn't mention if she's had a gastrectomy, but particularly if there's a partial or total gastrectomy, just the increased transit time or how quickly food is moving through because there isn't a reservoir for it to hang out. There isn't as much time for food to mix with digestive enzymes and bile salts that are needed for digestion and absorption. So things might go through unabsorbed. There also could be a decrease in enzyme production as well. So you don't have enough enzymes to digest the food and break it down for adequate absorption. And there also, with the lack of a stomach, you could end up with larger particles of food making it through to the intestine, and larger pieces of food make interacting with your digestive enzymes more challenging. So again, more food gets through, more nutrients get through without being absorbed. For some tips in general for chronic diarrhea management would be limiting insoluble fibers. So that's the type of fiber like wheat bran, stringy fibers, skins and seeds of fruits and vegetables. Lower fat diet would help, particularly if you're having evidence of fat malabsorption like oil in the stool. A lower lactose diet might help if there's some evidence of lactose malabsorption or lactose intolerance. And avoiding sugar alcohols as well, which can lead to diarrhea. And those can be prominent in some snacks or foods made for people with diabetes. Adding sources of soluble fiber can help as well. So sources of soluble fiber would be like oats, barley, peeled fruits, psyllium fiber as well can help to slow transit through the GI system so that you have more time to absorb and more time for those foods to be in contact with your digestive enzymes. And if there is a possibility of pancreatic insufficiency or a lack of pancreatic enzymes to break down your food, then you can perhaps have a test done to measure the fat in your stool and may consider the use of pancreatic enzyme replacement therapy, which may help with the malabsorption as well.
Okay, so I'm just being conscious of time. We're already over. Just our last question for today. And again, I will make sure that all these questions are answered at some point in time, whether through social media or on our website. One of our members is asking, I was diagnosed with stage 3B stomach cancer in 2011. After chemotherapy and radiation, I had a total gastrectomy where they created a pouch from my intestines. My question is, I am doing well with weight gain now, but I want to know if this procedure should be reviewed more because a lot of patients with total gastrectomy have problems with weight gain. And that's from Millie from BC.
I can comment quickly on the background and technical aspects of pouch creation. In the 60s and 70s, there's a lot of interest in generating sort of these artificial pouches using the small bowel and staple them together and to create a bit of a reservoir. And there's a whole series of different types. There's maybe 10 or 11 different types, all named after self-important surgeons who put their own names on the operations they did. That has really fallen out of favor in the vast majority of surgeons, I'd say nowadays. It's the simpler the operation, the better. So we don't create a pouch, but we end up finding is that small bowel does stretch. It takes a little bit longer than if you had a partial gastrectomy. But even if you have a total gastrectomy, the small bowel is used to reconstruct the intestine does stretch out, and people are able to gain weight, but it does take longer than it would be for partial. So although some people have had pouches in the past, I would say 99% of all gastrectomies done around the world are pouchless or just standard small bowel reconstructions of the intestine.
Okay, and my understanding is there is some new research going on at Mount Sinai Hospital here in Toronto by Dr. Brar to see whether the pouch is something that can be done in the future. And I know that, as with all treatment options with stomach cancer, every year we have new information. So thank you, Millie, for bringing that up for our attention. And I think this concludes our panel for the afternoon. Again, I wanted to just say a big thank you to all the speakers for joining us. And it is Saturday, so thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. Again, we couldn't have such a successful panel without you being present here today. So thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.